We've come at last to the final background lecture. Although I am still flirting with the idea of doing a lecture on Taylor Swift and the Greek lyricists, as I mentioned in the last one. But that probably won't be included in this playlist. Last week we covered the Greek influence upon English poetry by highlighting three major contributions. There was the Greek genius of representing human passion, the spiritual character, which is mainly Platonism, um, and the literary criticism of Aristotle, who systematized this psychological and critical and even formal approach to analyzing the art of poetry. And now we've come to our lecture on Latin literature. And I've structured this one a little bit differently. This is the last lecture before we launch into English poetry, the traditions of English poetry. We'll be beginning with Old English. So I've arranged this one to be preparatory to the survey ahead of us for the rest of the year. I'll focus primarily on Ovid, on Virgil, and on Horace, although Juvenal was also really important, and so if you have time, read his satires, especially the 10th one. But we're going to be reading these three major poets through the lens of literary history, English literary history. And I have a quote from John Drinkwater, who's an older literary historian. And here's his rough generalization. No two peoples were more unlike than the Greeks and the Romans. The Greeks were essentially artists, loving beauty, caring for all that made the individual life dignified and happy. They were intellectually adventurous, inquisitive in speculation, and daring in the profession of their own beliefs. The Romans, on the other hand, were eminently practical and unimaginative. Their genius was for war and politics, and their chief concern was for order and commercial prosperity. Now, like any generalization, this has its limits and its exceptions, but for the most part, I think this is a handy comparison for anyone undertaking their first exploration of the literatures that are often lumped under the term classical literature, both Greek and Roman. Three major poets of this lecture, Ovid, Virgil, Horace, were all contemporaries who lived during the age of Caesar Augustus, who reigned from 27 BC to AD 14. And they're often called the Augustan age poets of Roman literature. English literary history has its own so-called Augustan age, a time right after Charles II's return, lasting long into the 18th century. And it's called that because of the original Augustan age. And we'll talk about why that movement was largely indebted to these three poets. But let's begin with Ovid. Publius Ovidius Naso called Ovid and his Metamorphoses. Ovid is a poet with a keen narrative art and interest. His imagination bends towards the sexual and supernatural and otherworldly. He, I suppose, is the most imaginative in terms of fancy and flights of fancy. His lines are beautiful, and they often soar the highest in scenes of grief and violence. Just something to keep in mind. There's interesting, like an interdependency upon the violent scenes, whether it's sexual violence or whether it's war or whether it's intense grief with beautiful language. And that's a complex thing that critics and readers have had to wrestle with. One beautiful story from Ovid's Metamorphoses that has influenced a lot of literature has been the story of Orpheus and Eurydice. Orpheus and Eurydice. And I have a translation I'd like to read from A.D. Melville, although I hear that Mandelbaum's translation is really good. Jeffrey, who was here last week, mentioned Mandelbaum's translation. I wasn't able to find a paper copy, but I found some excerpts online, and it is superior, I think, to Melville's. It's much more poetic. Orpheus is a poet with a new wife, Eurydice. And his new wife, while she's wandering with her naiads, is bitten on her foot by a serpent and dies. Orpheus descends into Hades to the king and queen of the underworld, Persephone and Pluto, Lord of the Shades, and he brings his lyre with him. He goes down into Hades, finds them, and sings them this song. And this is from Melville's translation. And as he struck his lyre's sad chords, he said, "Ye deities who rule the world below, whether we mortal creatures all return, if simple truth, direct and genuine, may by your leave be told, I have come down, not with intent to see the glooms of hell, nor to enchain the triple snake-haired necks of Cerberus, but for my dear wife's sake, in whom a trodden viper poured his venom and stole her budding years. My heart has sought strength to endure. The attempt I'll not deny. But love has won, a god whose fame is fair in the world above. But here I doubt, though here too I surmise. And if that ancient tale of ravishment is true, you too were joined in love. Now by these regions filled with fear, by this huge chaos, these vast silent realms reweave, I implore the fate unwound too fast of my Eurydice. To you are owed ourselves in all creation. A brief while we linger, then we hasten, late or soon, to one abode. Here one road leads us all. Here in the end is home. Over humankind your kingdom keeps the longest sovereignty. She too, when ripening years reach their due term, shall own your rule. The favor that I ask is but to enjoy her love. And if the fates will not reprieve her, my resolve is clear, not to return. May two deaths give you cheer. And so he ends his speech. And this is what's happened while he's been speaking. So the music of his strings, so to the music of his strings he sang, and all the bloodless spirits wept to hear. And Tantalus forgot the fleeing water, and Ixion's wheel was tranced. The Danaids laid down their urns, the vultures left their feast, and Sisyphus sat rapt upon his stone. The good poetry of Orpheus has just captivated the entire kingdom of hell. And that's his plight. I'm going to read you another translation of what happens next. Although Ovid's influence on Greek literature lasted into the Middle Ages, or from the Middle Ages on, we have him influencing the French poets, Marie de France in her British Lays, or the Lays of Britain. Sir Orpheus, this is a tale reimagined as A Knight of King Arthur's Table, and so on, many operas. But Ovid's great impact upon English literature begins with Arthur Golding's English translation of Metamorphoses, translation that's often called Shakespeare's Ovid. This was a verse translation that was written in what's called 14ers. These are lines of a single line of 14 syllables made up of 7 iambs, roughly. Now, 14ers are usually pretty clunky and awkward, but Golding's lines are actually an exception to this. They are dynamic and supple. Ezra Pound also admired this translation and called it the most beautiful book in our language. That's high praise for a book that's not taught, and that was in his ABC of reading when Ezra Pound said that. I want to read from that just to show you what it's like. And so what happens after this music, starting here And neither Pluto nor his lady were so strong and hard of stomach to withhold his just petition long. They called forth Eurydice, who was yet among the new-come ghost, and limped of her wound. Her husband took her with condition that he should not back upon her look until the time that he were past the bounds of limbo quite, or else to lose his gift. They took a path that steep upright rose dark and full of foggy mist, and now they were within a kenning of the upper earth. When Orphea did begin to doubt him least she followed not, and through an eager love, desirous for her to see, he his eyes did backward move. Immediately she slipped back, he reaching out his hands, desirous to be caught, and for to catch her grasping stands. But nothing, save the slippery air, unhappy man, he caught. She dying now the second time complained of Orphea not. For why? What had she to complain, unless it were of love, which made her husband back again his eyes upon her move? Her last farewell she spake so soft that scarce he heard the sound, and then revolted to the place in which he had her found. Oh, just so tragic. And you can tell what's happened. The one law they gave him, you can have her back as long as you don't look upon her. And he does. And I find it interesting that Golding repeats the rhyme, the coupled rhyme, the two words. When first he looks back through an eager love, his eyes backward did move, and here that love and move again are here when addressing how Eurydice dealt with it. Unless it were a love, his eyes upon her move. And it's not by accident. It's not that he couldn't find another word or that he was being lazy. It was part of the art that he would use that word again. And it's just beautiful compared to the other poets who do 14ers who have written those. So yes, I said this was Shakespeare's Ovid. Golding was born around 1536, died around 1605. His life overlapped with the famous playwrights. Shakespeare could read Ovid in the original Latin, and he did, but Golding's English translation was also a favorite, it seems. And Gilbert Hyatt, who wrote the classical tradition, I've been referring to that throughout these lectures, he demonstrates the debt with a comparison of Golding and Shakespeare's Sonnet 60. This is interesting, so I'm going to pull this up for you all here. We know this line, or rather, this is the line from Golding's Ovid. As every wave drives other forth, and that which comes behind, by thrusteth and is thrust himself, even so the times by kind do fly and follow both at once, and evermore renew. This beginning, as every wave drives, we think immediately of Shakespeare's Sonnet 60, which has that famous opening. Like as the waves make to the pebbled shore, so do our minutes hasten to their end, each changing place with that which goes before. In sequent toil, all forwards do contend. And so this is partly how we know Shakespeare was reading this, and it was also just the very popular translation during his day. The classical tradition had its votaries in Shakespeare's time. There were traditions of poetry that went alongside the contemporaries of the metaphysical style. While the metaphysical style flourished in the love songs of John Donne and Marvell, and the devotional poets, George Herbert and Henry Vaughan, there was an even greater parallel tradition of classicists, traditionally along the school of Ben Jonson, another famous playwright, who honestly, during his time, was more famous than Shakespeare. And And his tradition, this classic tradition, uh, is participated in by Donne and Marvell as well. But as the 17th century in England progressed, the classical tradition became more and more associated with the Cavaliers, the supporters of King Charles in the Civil War, the Civil Wars. So the Royalists they had the Cavalier poetry, which was mostly inspired by the lyrics of Catullus and some Greek poets as well. But then you also had the parliamentary forces, sometimes associated with the Puritan plain style, simple, emotional, unaffected, theological. So you have those two traditions. Now, after the monarchy was restored in 1660, with the return of Charles II, English poetry had cooled considerably. No longer were the poets interested in exploring the psychological labyrinths of metaphysical poetry or of entertaining theological debate or religious experience in poetry. Neither were they interested in passionate love songs, the sonnets, the emotional flights of fancy. They all fell out of vogue. And after a period of civil war and religious unrest, many poets wanted stability. They looked to the cool and controlled strains of the Augustan poets, Virgil and Horace especially. Hence, when we talk about the Augustan poets in the late 17th and early 18th century in England, we're speaking of poets who looked back to Rome's Augustan age, which had similarly emerged from a period of civil unrest. And that's no coincidence. Poets such as John Dryden, Alexander Pope, Jonathan Swift looked to Virgil and Horace and the satirists like Juvenal as their models. Virgil's Aeneid was particularly important for them, where Homer's heroes are known for their action, their power, their strength of will and determination. Virgil's hero Aeneas is known for his piety. Aeneas, as you probably know, is one of the Trojan heroes who escapes the plundering of Troy by the Greeks, and he becomes the founder of Rome. And Virgil wanted to give his countrymen a national epic, one that would place them within history and myth. And you see Milton doing the same thing with Paradise Lost. I have that on the mind as I'm doing the lectures for Paradise Lost as well these weeks. I just want to show you the lines of Dryden's translations. It's of Virgil's Aeneid. It's a magnificent translation. And this is the opening of Virgil's Aeneid. Arms, and the man I sing, who forced by fate and haughty Juno's unrelenting hate, expelled and exiled, left the Trojan shore. Long labors, both by sea and land he bore. And in the doubtful war, before he won the Latian realm and built the destined town, his banished gods restored to rights divine and settled sure succession in his line, from whence the race of Alban fathers come and the long glories of majestic Rome. And it's no coincidence that Dryden is interested in this at this time in literary history. Virgil aimed to, among other things, instill a sense of piety as an essential Roman quality. He wanted to restore piety as something that was characteristic of his people. And Dryden, in his translation of the Aeneid, wants to highlight the same thing. And you can read this in the preface to his translation of Virgil. Dryden explained that he writes, quote, piety alone comprehends the whole duty of man towards the gods, towards his country, and towards his relations. So you have the sense of piety being not only national and religious, but also familial, it's domestic. Religion in England at this time, in the 17th century, was a crazy time to be an English Christian or unchristian, even crazier if you weren't. Religion in England was extraordinarily contentious during the 17th and 18th centuries. While English Protestantism continued to shatter into division and persecution like a porcelain vase, many men and women found refuge for their piety in the uncontested sentiments of the Augustan age poets, chiefly Virgil. Now, poets during this time, I've said this before on the channel, but when we think of a poet, we often think of a private, withdrawn figure, a romantic poet. But poets during this time in English literary history and in Rome, the first century, considered themselves public voices, adjudicators of public taste and morals. Addison and Steele's Spectator essays, I don't know if you've ever read those. They're good examples of just delicious prose for one, but also how literati, whether poets or essayists, felt the responsibility to sustain public piety by sound advice, through sanity, through beautifully controlled sense. And you see this enacted in their beautiful sentences. Addison and Steele are just amazing prose writers. And it's interesting that whenever people emerge from tumultuous times, they usually have a taste for stability and not for experimentation. There's some exceptions to this, but you can see this after the First World War. Poets were looking back to the classical languages and literatures as guides for good poetry and sound sense. But this also goes to show how literature is sometimes evaluated, at least to some degree, by cultural prejudices, by moments. The poetry of so-called metaphysical school of Donne, Cowley, and Herbert were considered vulgar and grotesque by the 18th century English poets. Shakespeare's drama, though sometimes performed, was never enjoyed with the same religious admiration as it is today. And that's thanks largely to the Romantics. But generally speaking, readers of the Augustan era in England preferred the stately over the surreal, the sensible over the supernatural, and the reasonable over the fanciful. And you can see this partly in the translations of Virgil, in the interest in Virgil, but also in Virgil himself, in his poetry. Now let's talk about Horace. I think he's my favorite. What might be called classical correctness of the Augustan age poets lasted into the 18th century, into neoclassicism, talking about the English Augustan poets. The meditative, well-regulated measures of the Latin poet Horace caught the admiration of many English poets of this era. We have Alexander Pope, who writes this in his essay on criticism. Horace still charms with graceful negligence, and without method talks us into sense, will, like a friend, familiarly convey the truest notions in the easiest way. He who supreme in judgment as in wit might boldly censure, as he boldly writ, yet judged with coolness, though he sung with fire. His precepts teach, but what his works inspire, our critics take a contrary extreme. They judge with fury, but they write with phlegm. Nor suffers Horace more in wrong translations by wits than critics, as in wrong quotations. Speaking about the contemporary abuse of Horace during the early 18th century. What's valued here by the English poets of Horace? Graceful negligence. I love that phrase. And Alexander Pope, this is such an example of him. It's iambic poetry. It's called heroic verse, heroic couplets. And you can see this working into sense. Alexander Pope really perfected the couplet in a way that John Dryden paved the way, and then Alexander Pope just perfected it. In fact, Pound told Eliot that there's no use in writing in couplets now because Pope did it perfectly. And he's got these lovely phrases, graceful negligence, which is just not just the perfect noun, but it's always the perfect noun with the perfect adjective. Graceful negligence. It refers to Horace's casual tone. And this is what's so charming about Horace. He speaks to us in a friendly tone, not as a railing preacher behind a pulpit, but as a trusted advisor. He isn't methodological like Aristotle. Um, you're reading Aristotle, you're a student behind a desk listening to a teacher at a chalkboard tell you, and Aristotle will hand you back your poems marked up with the red pen. But Horace is like taking a stroll in the garden with a friend, and he will gently correct you and guide you along the way that poetry should go. He's full of great advice. So his work of criticism, Ars Poetica, the art of poetry, talks of unity and simplicity, but doesn't exactly enact it because it's so discursive. That's not to say that Horace is careless in his discourse. His poetry, rather, has this unstudied ease, graceful negligence that carries you along like a conversation. Edmund Waller, contemporary of John Dryden, poet of the Restoration during Charles II, his restoration, he writes this of Horace. This is his poem upon the translation by the Earl of Roscommon. Horace will our superfluous branches prune, give us new rules, and keep our harp in tune. Direct us how to back the winged horse, favor his flight, and moderate his force. Though poets may of inspiration boast, their rage ill-governed in the clouds is lost. He that proportioned wonders can disclose, at once his fancy and his judgment shows. Chaste moral writing we may learn from hence, neglect of which no wit can recompense. The fountain which from Helicon proceeds, that sacred stream which never waters weeds, nor make the crop of thorns and thistles grow, which envy or perverted nature sow. Well-sounding verses are the charm we use, heroic thoughts and virtue to infuse. Things of deep sense we may in prose unfold, but they move more in lofty numbers told. And Horace's Ars Poetica is poetry. It's written in poetry in verse. Notice what's valued here by Waller and by Pope, especially by Waller here. Pruning the superfluous, prudence, tunefulness, verbal chastity, moral chastity, and moderation. And this is so Horace. In his Ars Poetica, Horace advises people who want to be poets by saying things like, I have a couple of quotes here collected. As forests change their leaves with each year's decline, and the earliest drop off, so with words the old race dies, and, like the young of humankind, the newborn bloom and thrive. Interesting commentary on the changing of language with each generation. Another quotation. A poem is like a picture. He's got these similes. You've noticed his similes here. A poem is like a picture. One strikes your fancy more the nearer you stand, another the farther away. This courts the shade, that will wish to be seen in the light, and dreads not the critic insight of the judge. This pleased once, that, though 10 times called for, will always please. And don't we just know some of those poems that no matter how many times we call them up or read, they always please. And it's what he says is so true of poetry, and it requires a different kind of criticism to recognize this. John Milton, I think, has a charm the further back you stand. John Donne, the nearer you stand. And depending on how you're reading it and taking into account the evaluation of poetry as a critic would, you would recognize this and judge accordingly. And this is another of his poets either aim to benefit or to amuse, or to utter words at once pleasing and helpful to life. Matthew Arnold, a Victorian critic, another great classicist, said that poetry was the criticism of life, and he didn't mean the tearing down or the critiquing of life. It was more about how to live, the art of living. Often Horace's sensibleness is enacted in strict, I won't say predictable, but even meter, which is never monotonous. It's difficult to get a good sense of Horace's measures in translations. Um, I've heard it recited and read aloud several times in different odes, and there is certainly a rhythm there. But this English translation by uh, Philip Francis is a good example of what it would sound like. And I'm going to follow this up with a few more examples from English poetry. Unless you light your early lamp to find a moral book, unless you form your mind to noble studies, you shall forfeit rest, and love or envy shall distract your breast. He's always giving advice. This is the wisdom literature of Horace. For the hurt eye, an instant cure you find. Then why neglect for years the sickening mind? Dare to be wise. Begin, for once begun, your task is easy. Half the work is done. And sure the man who has it in his power to practice virtue and protracts the hour, waits like the rustic till the river dry, still glides the river and will ever glide. Um, there's something about that eludes description. Graceful negligence, not quite, but just friendly. Oh, I've just used that word so much. Friendly, conversational, in a way, intimate. That's part of the charm of Horace, I think. Now, let me give you an example of this correctness. So many poets writing in English wanted to take what was essential and beautiful about Horace's style and infuse English poetry with it. And I have just two examples here before we wrap up. Many people, and they both come from the 18th century, many people don't know that Thomas Gray's famous Elegy Written in a Country Churchyard was not originally styled as an elegy. He was persuaded to call it that because of the elegiac meditative tone. But Thomas Gray, who was a man who lived and breathed the classics, said he was at work on a Horatian ode. He wrote this as a Horatian ode. And it is, and you get a sense of the measured meter, the beautiful musical quality, and also the chaste diction and the stateliness of it. Here's the beginning of his great elegy. The curfew tolls the knell of parting day. The lowing herd winds slowly o'er the lea. The ploughman homeward plods his weary way, and leaves the world to darkness and to me. This is one of the most beautiful poems in English, especially when they came out of the 18th century. And there are many that are beautiful like this. Another is, by the way, another elegy, this one written by Dr. Samuel Johnson on the death of his friend, Dr. Robert Levitt, an old physician who lived with him in London. And again, you have the ear for that rhythm and the diction. Here it is, really stately diction, stately measures. Speaking of Robert Levitt, these are the last three stanzas. His virtues walked their narrow round, nor made a pause, nor left a void, and sure the eternal Master found the single talent well employed. The busy day, the peaceful night, unfelt, uncounted, glided by. His frame was firm, his powers were bright, though now his 80th year was nigh. Then with no throbbing fiery pain, no cold gradations of decay, death broke at once the vital chain, and freed his soul the nearest way. Probably the most dignified lines in English and tender lines in English on the death of one's friend. And there's something about Levitt's, the description of his virtues that walked their narrow rounds, like the meter walking the rounds there. It's perfect iambic pentameter, not monotonous, not hard on the ear, doesn't put you into an iambic stupor when you've closed the book, um, but is stately and almost regal in a way, so filled with dignity. Okay, to wrap up here, although the lecture focused, I know I focused mostly on 18th century poetry, Restoration era up to the 18th century. But that's not to say that Latin poetry only had its influence on England's Restoration and 18th century poetry. It would be a mistake to suggest that classical literature was unimportant to the Romantics, to the Victorians, or to the modernists, especially the modernists. Wordsworth was an avid reader of Virgil. Keats, deeply, deeply indebted to the lyric traditions of Horace and of Pindar. Byron, as many of the other 18th century critics and poets, Byron to the satires of Juvenal. And the Victorians too returned to them. Charles Landor was perhaps the most committed classicist of the 19th century. And modernism, of course, rediscovered it as well. Ezra Pound has a three-line poem, the thought of what America would be like if the classics had a wide circulation troubles my sleep. And he was really trying to get the classics into English poetry and to invigorate his own poetry with the vigor of the classics. And T.S. Eliot as well has a book, The Classics and the Man of Letters. It was published in 1942. It's a whole discussion on how the classical tradition impacted the education of Shakespeare and Milton. So, like embers in the night, the classics have smoldered for centuries and lie ready to be fanned into flame by the faintest breath. There's a whole wealth there ready to be discovered. But for our purposes, I hope these background lectures were helpful guides to you. And as we turn to the traditions of English poetry, we'll be casting our eyes back towards them again. So this was good groundwork to begin with. So thank you all who are here with me in person on Patreon, who are supporting these lectures, helping me get time to dedicate time to getting these out there for other people on YouTube. And for those of you who are watching this on YouTube, thank you for joining me. And I look forward to getting into English poetry very soon.